don't want to go back to the new normal, to the old normal. The old normal was terrible for lots of people. And so I want to create a new future that doesn't ignore, that does lift up, and that deals honestly with some of the problems that we have as a society, and some of the problems that we have as a community here where I live.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the Louisiana NOW podcast. I am your host, Todd Rossnagel. Great to have everyone along with us. That voice off the top of today's episode, Dr. Graham Bodie. He is our guest today. He is a past professor at LSU, currently at the University of Mississippi. He is a Methodist. He attended Broadmoor United Methodist Church when he was in Baton Rouge. He is also the Chief Operating Officer of the Listen First Project. Listening. That's our topic today. Listening is a lost art in some way. Some would say it's not even an art. It's more scientific in nature, and most importantly, we all know listening takes work. We've all been there, right? We've been victims of people not listening to us, and we've been complicit in not listening to others. Graham Bodie, our guest today, is an expert in listening, and the Listen First Project is an outreach of a shared expertise in listening. The nonprofit exists to mitigate our frayed social division one conversation at a time, one listening conversation at a time, to listen across our differences and build positive relationships. The goal is to lift up the power of understanding, not necessarily agreeing, embracing that everybody has an inherent humanity that deserves to be respected. And we can see and hear the world differently, but that doesn't mean that we're either right or wrong, but that we are different. It sounds so simple. Yet turn on the news, and here we are in the midst of a pandemic where thousands are dying each and every day, and we are frayed. We are split. In some cases, though this is perhaps an oversimplification on my part, it seems we are spending more and more time speaking than listening, at least on the social media front, which continues to dominate the national conversation. So, how do we listen? How do we listen more effectively? How do we enhance our listening ability? And why is listening so important? All part of our discussion today with Graham Bodie. We pick it up where he begins discussing how complex problems come with complex solutions. And the need to listen to the entire conversation is more important than ever before. We've done it in the past, and hopefully we can do it again.
You know, the last time that we had a national emergency like this was 9/11. And, you know, we became quite united, you know, in the weeks immediately following that. We were all, or not all of us, but most of us were, you know, you saw people crying because 3,000 people died. And now, right, it's possible that 3,000 people per day will die because of COVID, depending on the models that you're looking at. And yet we're making it a political issue, which really makes me sad that we're making this political and capital P political, not just lowercase p political, rather than honestly sort of, you know, debating and dialoguing and coming to some sort of agreement that this is more complex than any one perspective, right, can solve. And so again, action is, you know, where the rubber meets the road, is we need to be doing things, but conversation can be part of that action. And sometimes conversation is the beginning of that action and one of the necessary components of solving problems. So a very long-winded way for me to say that, yes, problems existed. Yes, the pandemic is highlighting those problems. And yes, we're not allowing our, as Abraham Lincoln said, we're not allowing our better angels to shine when that's what we should be doing.
And on a positive end, it does amaze me that on one level, we as human beings, we know exactly how to listen, right? When it's important. We've sheltered in place. We're wearing masks. We're trying our very best to stay 6 feet apart. With regard to listening, Graham, we know how to listen, don't we?
Yes and no. I think that it's one of those behaviors that everyone, you know, if you ask them how important is it, and how often do you do it? Everyone will raise their hand. Yes, it's important, but how many classes have you ever taken specifically devoted to how to do it well? And yet, through our, K through 12 education, there's a lot of attention placed on, speaking well. You could take a public speaking class, you learn to write a persuasive, essay. But there aren't large scale efforts to teach students to listen well, and compound that with the fact that we all have our own idiosyncratic definitions of what it even means to listen well. When you're 3-year-olds, when you're 3 years old, it means that you're obedient, that you stand in line, and that you wash your hands or whatever. And when you're in high school, it means that you can comprehend some 20-minute lecture and diffuse it down to its essence. And then when you're in the midst of trauma, it's showing up and being there and being fully present with another. But we're not really trained to do that, even if we can muster up for a moment sort of the willingness and the motivation to do so. So I'll say, yeah, we all have the capacity to be great listeners, but we don't always have the practice in doing it very well.
We are so used to speaking, right? It is how, in some ways, we garner power. But I've heard you say that research shows that the listener is the one that is actually guiding the conversation. I just find that so incredibly fascinating. Can you help us unpack that? What does it mean that the listener is the one who's actually guiding the conversation?
Yeah, so to problematize that, at least for a moment, it's hard to separate speaker and listener. There's this dichotomy. I think so the first answer there is that to suggest there is a speaker and then a listener, at least in our Western context, means that there is an active person and a passive person. At least that's how it's been kind of demarcated, right? That listeners are passively as opposed to active participants in a conversation. So the work that I'm drawing from when I say that listeners are very powerful, guiders of conversation. Jan Bavelis is a scholar from in British Columbia, and she basically, her term is that listeners are co-narrators, and what she means by that is that the behaviors that listeners enact while they are actively engaged with another person's story shapes that story. So when you respond in particular ways, both with your face and your body and your hands and your eyes, as well as with the words that you speak or the noises that you make while you're in that role of, primarily allowing another person to share their story, that those types of responses, those listener responses, really do help a speaker, or they could hinder a speaker from telling their story. What she's done in some of these, so the typical paradigm is to have somebody come in and tell what she calls a close call story. It's a story where something almost happened, but it ended okay in the long run. So the example that I like to use is that a woman is reading in bed, and she has a reading lamp clamped to her headboard. She falls asleep. And while she's asleep, the lamp falls on a pillow and catches the pillow on fire, right? So she's telling the story. It takes her about 90 seconds to tell the story. And as she's telling that story, if you look at those micro momentary facial expressions that the listener makes, they're beginning to look surprised, and then they look surprised at the very moment that the speaker is telling those surprising sort of climactic elements of the story. And what happens is if you put people in conditions, if you put listeners in conditions where they're distracted, and one way to do that is to tell them, while you're listening to this story, I want you to count the number of words that begin with the letter T, and I want you to press a button underneath the table every time you hear a word that begins with the letter T. So that distracts you from fully being attentive. And what they find in those conditions where listeners are distracted is that the storyteller tells less coherent stories. They tell stories for shorter amounts of time, and they're more likely to say things like, well, yeah, that's it. That's all I have, as opposed to elaborating on the content and the emotions in that story. So listeners, even if they're quote unquote silent with their words or their vocalizations, are very active and loud in their facial expressions, in the ways that they position their body, and the ways that they show up as an active participant in those conversations. And so there's lots of other research by other laboratories across the country, and there's some in other countries as well, that have replicated these results to suggest that listeners are doing a lot, or can do a lot, to either help storytellers tell better stories, or hinder a storyteller's ability to fully elaborate in ways that are helpful for the story to kind of help that person make sense of the events of their day, of their week, or whatever the case might be.
So, Graham, it almost sounds to me that as someone is speaking to another human being, if that other human is engaged in true active listening, that the conversation just comes alive. It becomes more than what it could be. I can't help but think about how pastors right now are not with people, and instead they are preaching to a camera lens where they can't see and they can't see people listening. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. So when you don't have an audience, it's why comedy isn't as funny, right? The same joke given to a camera without the laughter. I mean, there's pretty good research to show that you laugh more often when other people are laughing.
Right.
So when, if you're watching, whether it's a preacher or it's Jimmy Fallon, he's really funny, but he's a lot funnier when there's people around laughing at him. Preachers are effective, and they're telling really, solid truths, but they're more effective, and the truths are more likely to resonate when there are people in the audience, doing things and making noises, and part of that is because the preacher gets feedback from the audience that says you're right on, or I'm confused, or keep going, or do that again, or whatever the case might be.
Graham, give us like a tangible, give us some, what would be your nugget of how to listen better? I can't help but think my father used to always just tell me, shut up and listen. And somehow I don't think that was the right advice. What kind of advice can you give us to listen better, to listen more intentionally?
Yes, I mean, listening is simultaneously a mindset, a set of behaviors, and what goes on inside your head when you're processing information. It's all of these things. I call them the ABCs of listening. It's attitudinal, it's behavioral, and it's cognitive. And attitudinal comes first and foremost. It's so to be a better listener, you have to have the intention to be the kind of listener that is desirable. And so you've got to, we have all these sayings in our language, right? That think before you speak. But have you ever heard someone say, think before you listen? What's the purpose of your listening? Why are you going into a situation to be the type of listener that you're going to be? And so first and foremost, it's about taking responsibility for a minimum of 50% and perhaps 100% of how that conversation, trajects, where that conversation goes. But of course, good intentions, are just that. They're good intentions. And so as you are showing up for listening situations in ways that will be most productive for the other person, being mindful that conversation isn't about you, it's about them. It's about their agenda and what they need to accomplish, not about you and what you need to accomplish. And so those good intentions, I think, get you situated to then, behave in ways both internally and externally that are going to be most useful. And so always therefore reflecting on and being in the moment what does this person need right now from me? What am I going to do that's going to allow them to be their best, speaking self in this moment? And a lot of that comes down to, validating, even if you don't agree with that person's perspective, validating that the way that they feel is legitimate because they're feeling it, right? Even if you disagree with the genesis of that feeling, even if you honestly sort of, have a visceral negative reaction to their experience, the fact is that it's their experience. And so, being curious and modeling that curiosity by asking questions that get that person to sort of unpack exactly where is it they're coming from and why it is that they feel the way that they feel, not only helps you maintain that mode of curiosity as a listener, but it helps them to realize why they believe what they believe. Because, Todd, look, I wake up every morning thinking that I have justified true beliefs, and going to bed every day knowing that I believed some things that aren't necessarily in line with what God would want me to believe that day. And so I need to be fully aware that just because I believe something doesn't necessarily mean that it is truth. And so I, as a curious person, I need to take that curiosity not only in my internal spiritual life, but also in my external listener life, and be curious about people, not just furious about their positions.
We're back with Graham Bodie in just a moment, but first, a message from our sponsor, the United Methodist Foundation of Louisiana. They are up to something big. They want to help you with your most unique ministry idea. With the quarantine in place and an unknown end date, churches and pastors are having to rise to the occasion and get creative with ministry. For some, it's broadcasting worship services online, Bible studies over the internet. All of these unique ideas cost money. And that's where the foundation comes in. Your foundation has set aside $100,000 to award to churches and ministries within the Louisiana Annual Conference to help fund creative ministry. The idea must support evangelism, mission, and/or outreach during this unprecedented time, and they are encouraging all of us to use our imagination and to use our hearts. If you have any questions, need to read the nitty-gritty details, you can head to their website, umf.org, more specifically, umf.org/unique. We pick up our conversation now with Graham Bodie, and my next question was focused on the pandemic and whether it's negatively affecting listening or is it having a positive effect?
I'd love to say that the quarantine has made me sort of, more grounded and having my priorities straight, but it took me a while. I went through all the emotions. I was frustrated that I had to do this. I was, bent out of shape that I couldn't meet my deadlines. I was, frantically, trying to, figure out how to homeschool and, jam 50 hours worth of work into 20 hours of sustained attention, and to get enough sleep and to pay attention to my family. So in a lot of ways, I think that, the quarantine is potentially a positive, but initially sort of painful. We're sort of in the beginning of a campaign right now that we're calling Weaving Community, and it's a joint campaign between Listen First Project and National Conversation Project and the Weave Project, David Brooks's Weave Project. And what we're trying to get people to admit and enter into a conversation about is the only way to possibility is through the pain. We've got to be reflective, even if it's painful to do so. And I think what this moment is potentially allowing us to do is to do that reflection in a way that, where it's okay societally to be vulnerable, even though society typically tells us, particularly, certain classes of us, that it's not okay to be vulnerable. Bring your vulnerabilities, bring your pain, and be honest about it where you are. Even if that means you're not in any kind of pain. I mean, be honest about that, not be embarrassed about that, but be sort of honest and fully reflective of where you are in the midst of this. So I don't know. Ultimately, I think time will tell whether this moment was ultimately a positive or a negative in certain ways for the country and for individual people in the country. But I certainly see hope in the midst of it, but also fully aware that that's because I sit in a pretty privileged position as somebody who hasn't lost his job, as somebody who is financially stable, is somebody who does have a support system. And so, fully acknowledging that is not everyone's experience. And so I'm not going to speak to whether it's going to be a potential positive for everybody. But I do think there's possibility in that for us to recognize that as a society as a whole, and to make a new normal. I don't want to go back to the new normal, to the old normal. The old normal was terrible for lots of people. And so I want to create a new future that doesn't ignore, that does lift up, and that deals honestly with some of the problems that we have as a society, and some of the problems that we have as a community here where I live.
As I reached out to schedule this episode, Graham, the lectionary text at the time was the Emmaus story, and it sort of flooded social media airwaves for a weekend there. And I couldn't help but notice how much listening Jesus modeled for us. What would be your response to listening as a Christ follower?
Oh, such a big question. I think in my own spiritual practice, which is not always strong, we're taught to be reflective. We're taught to, earnestly seek, the will of God and be more Christ-like every day. And I do think part of that is showing up for people, being with them in their vulnerability, and again, putting aside our own agendas. I mean, one of the last things that Christ said was "Your will and not mine." And so, if we're modeling that as listeners, it's that person's agenda and not mine. And so. I ask myself every day, who is it that I need to reach out to today? And I set reminders on my phone to make sure that I'm keeping up with those individuals, every couple of days, that I'm trying to teach my children, to do the same. And so I think it's reflectivity on ourselves. Where are we spiritually? How can we be better followers of Christ in our own daily walk? And also, how can we encourage others to do the same? And how can we sit with them, even if it's over a text or through a Zoom meeting, or congregation, right? How can we sit with others in honest reflection, not to solve a problem, not to quote unquote help them, but to just be with them and to, show them the love of Christ by simply being present and acknowledging that the way that I'm experiencing this world and this pandemic isn't universal and doesn't dictate how other people ought to respond to this moment in our history.
Dr. Graham Bodie, one-time Louisianian, past professor at LSU, and now at Ole Miss, listening educator, consultant, so much more. We thank you for your time.
Thank you, Todd.
Our thanks again to Graham Bodie with the Listen First Project, a project that exists to do more together than individually. Their mission, aggregate and amplify all of the many organizations that are in the business of listening and those who help with listening. If you would like to help them, if you'd like to learn more, you can do so by simply taking a pledge to listen first to understand. You can do that at their website, listenfirstproject.org. Your pledge, as they say, will help tip the scales toward a stronger and more equitable future for our nation and better relationships in our daily lives. A link to their website can be found on the show notes of today's episode. We thank you for joining us. For Mary Burley, our show producer, the United Methodist Foundation, our sponsor, I am your host, Todd Rossnagel. Thanks again for joining us. Before you listen again to the Louisiana Now podcast, may we remember that Jesus listened with ears of grace. May we model that same kind of listening today with someone we know.